Hello and welcome to Beyond Braille, an inclusive technology for a fairer world, presented by Monash Tech Talks. Please keep your questions and comments coming through during the entire session, and we will read them out and throw them at our panelists as we get going with the session. We're really pleased to have you all with us today and trust that everyone will participate in today's session. Please have some questions ready. This is a safe space and all views are respected and valued. I'm your host, Naz Campanella. I am the ABC's National Disability Affairs reporter. I'm also a woman who has lived experience of disability. I am blind and I also have a neurological condition called Charcot-Marie-Tooth or CMT neuropathy. And it basically means that I have a lack of sensitivity and muscle tone in my hands, arms, legs, and feet. I would like to start by acknowledging all the different lands at which we are coming to this session from today. We are all either in lockdown or wherever you might be. So I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I would also particularly like to respectfully ask you to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, at which I know many of you are coming from today. I particularly am in Sydney, so I am on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend a warm welcome to people who, any First Nations people on the call, but also anyone with lived experience of disability who is joining us today. I'd now like to introduce our panelists. We have three fabulous panelists for you to hear from today and ask your questions. Let me introduce them now. We have Maryanne Diamond, board member, Australian Network on Disability and former president, World Blind Union. Maryanne is a woman who was born blind. She's one of Monash's mathematical statistics and information technology alumni. In fact, she was alumni of 2019. She's held a number of roles within the NDIS at the general manager level. I did actually remind everyone to do an audio description of themselves prior to this call, and I've realised that I have forgotten to do that myself. So before I throw to Maryanne to do her own audio description, I will do mine. So I am a fair-skinned woman in my early 30s. I have dark brown shoulder-length hair, which is done up in a ponytail today. I'm sitting in front of a grey wall and I am wearing a sort of orange top with a navy blue jacket over the top. So Maryanne, if I could throw to you before I introduce our other panelists so you may do your own audio description.
Thanks, Naz. So I too am a fair-skinned person with brown hair, longer than I'd like because in lockdown I can't go to the hairdresser to get it cut. I'm about double the age of Naz. I'm in my early 60s. I'm sitting here in a room. Behind me is a blank wall with a part of a frame you might see, and it was me doing a speech at the UN after the adoption of the Marrakesh Treaty to make information accessible for people who are blind or have a print disability.
Thank you and welcome to Maryanne. I now introduce our second panellist, Kim Marriott, Head of Department, Human-Centred Computing. Professor Marriott obtained his PhD in 1989 and later joined Monash in 1993 after working at IBM for 4 years. Kim, can I get you to give us your audio description, please?
Thanks, Naz. So like Maryanne, I'm about 60 years old, fair-skinned, maybe with a few more wrinkles. I've got blue glasses and I'm wearing an orange shirt with a black jacket, and I'm sitting in my bedroom to hide away from the rest of my family.
Thank you and welcome, Kim. And our final panellist for our session today is Leona Holloway. She's a PhD candidate and research assistant working alongside Kim in the area of inclusive technologies. Now, Leona's work explores how emerging technologies can be used to improve access to graphics by people who are blind or have low vision. Over to you, Leona.
Thanks, Naz. So I'm also a fair-skinned woman in my late 40s, and I also have my hair tied back. I'm wearing a dress that I made myself, but you probably can't see it in the Zoom anyway. And I'm in my home office, so I have a 3D printer glowing in the background and a couple of 3D prints as well on the desk.
Thank you to Leona, and welcome to you as well. Well, look, this is a really interesting topic to be a part of. I'm thrilled that I have been asked to facilitate this discussion because I started out using Braille, and then when I was diagnosed with my particular neurological condition, I had to then move on to other forms of technology. So I use things like voice to text technology or JAWS on my laptop, which is a screen reading software that scans everything on the screen and reads it out aloud, essentially. Also came to rely on audiobooks and all of those sorts of things. And really, technology has played a pivotal role in everything that I do in my life, from school to university, right through to work. And I, coming from a perspective of having started out with Braille, it would have been ideal for me to be able to pull all of those together. And unfortunately for me, I wasn't in a position where I could, but I'm really looking forward to this conversation where we can talk about the role that both technology and Braille can play together and where we are going with all of that in the future. So really, if I can kind of start us with looking at what are some modern day needs of people living with disability in an increasingly digitized world. If I can maybe start with you, Leona.
Sure. So I guess my perspective, I actually started out as a Braille transcriber, and that was in the days when we had print books but not electronic text. So the big emphasis then was about having to transcribe everything from scratch. And now, of course, it's changed completely. So the print is available electronically and then can be translated to audio or to Braille quite easily. And so there are lots of advantages that have come with technology in these times. But also there are things that haven't caught up. So things like graphics, which is one area that I'm working in, haven't caught up. Things like smartphones. I think Maryanne can probably talk a lot about how helpful smartphones are, but also things like touch screens are then creating barriers. So I think there's probably two sides to the question.
Yeah, Maryanne, if I could go to you to explain, I guess, some of the things that you've encountered, like the touch screens. I know for me personally, I've gone to pay for something and I've been asked to, put in the PIN. It's a touch screen. I'm not able to do that. And then I'm either forced to make the decision of going to get cash from an ATM or essentially handing over your PIN to somebody.
Yeah, thanks, Naz. A bit like Leona, the world has changed in my lifetime because it's quite a long lifetime. When I started my life, there wasn't much technology, but technology is here in everything we do. And in some things that we've done well as people with disabilities. And I wouldn't separate Braille as being distinct from technology because I think Braille is part of technology, especially now in its production, reading equipment and so on. But touchscreens are a big thing, but iPhones have been wonderful for me. I think building accessibility into off-the-shelf items is what people with disabilities want and need. I think some of the issues for people with disabilities are about the cost of equipment and the timeliness of when they're available. And I would extend, this digitized world to everything in our house, where we have everything now menu driven, like our televisions, like our microwaves, like our cooking facilities, to access to the physical environment, GPS and so on. So, I might have gone off a bit, Naz, but I think it's in all of our lives. And for some people, it's been life-changing, but for many, it still remains a barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kim, have you got some thoughts on that? I mean, we've moved so quickly, really, in a short space of time, one would argue.
We have, Naz, and I mean, so many of those technologies, iPhones, screen readers, etc., have really made a big difference. But there still is a little way to go. So it's great to have a screen reader, but if it's reading from web pages, then those web pages need to have been designed to be accessible in the first place, and that still remains an issue. I also think it's interesting how COVID-19 has really exposed some of the limitations in access that people who are blind and have low vision face, like access to charts and graphics about COVID, or checking in using QR code.
There's also, I've recently found out that there is a Braille sort of, not a Braille QR code, but it is in Braille where you can feel the outline, and the QR code is in the middle of the square, so to speak. And it's started to be used around Queensland and starting to become a bit more sort of well known in other states. But that's been really interesting, that people have had to figure out sort of new ways in this COVID space. One of the things I found really difficult is when you have to stand 1.5 meters away from people. How do I know where to stand? How do I know? So that's one need I think that's arisen in the last 18 months that really wasn't sort of catered for particularly people with visual disabilities, but for people with disability. Are there, how has a more digitized world sort of influenced our lives? Maryanne, can I go to you on this?
Yeah, I guess I come back to a point I made earlier. I think for those of us who are employed, have access to resources, and can get training in new products, it's been huge. Myself, I do banking online. I can mostly do shopping online. If, as Kim talked about, if the websites have been designed accessible, that can happen. I've worked from home for the last year and a half really, and think I have all the equipment I need. However, if JAWS does not work and I'm here alone, I can do nothing until someone comes along to assist. So that has those limitations. So I think there is very much the haves and have-nots, and and I emphasize what we as people with disabilities really want is when a product is developed, that it be designed and developed accessible. I led the work at the international level on the development of the Marrakesh Treaty, because we knew that 95% of every books published every year are not accessible to blind people. So one of the big missions was to try and get them born digital, in the beginning. And, that is still unfolding. But so access to information remains a big issue for us, but we have made some progress.
I think one of the things I've noticed is that while access to digital technology can really enhance our lives, as we've heard, there are also times where it really does limit our independence. And you mentioned there, if JAWS doesn't work for you, then you're kind of stuck. And I've definitely experienced that component, but also the issue of, for example, going and using a lift. And if there is a lift that you need to select your floor before you actually jump in the lift, and it's sort of got that touch screen where you've got to select the floor number. And I always had to ask people for assistance, and that really limited my independence and, made me feel like I was therefore reliant on other people. And only in the last week have I actually did find one of those lifts that had an audio component built into it. So it is those things that you kind of do get quite excited about. Leona, in your work that you have done over the many years, have you sort of seen in the digital world the sort of the ways that it's influencing people's lives?
Definitely. Actually, in terms of this, I was thinking about my kids who are on the autism spectrum, so kind of looking at another aspect of disability. So for them, during COVID, they're thriving socially because none of the kids are interacting visually or using things like facial expressions and gestures, they're all just relying on audio as they play together online. And so for them, it's really opened up the social world for them.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, that's really interesting. And Kim, what about you?
Yeah, look, I just wanted to come back to Maryanne's point about if you've got access, the digitised world is generally, it's been of great benefit, but to think about people in developing countries who haven't yet got access to our more digitised world. But that is changing. Smartphone take-up throughout the whole world is, doubled, trebled. And so I think that's going to make a massive difference to people with disabilities in developing countries as well.
Mm. One piece of technology that I know has also very much influenced my life is things like the smart speakers in our homes that you can connect to all kinds of, and Maryanne, you have definitely reflected on this earlier, but that you can connect to all kinds of different bits of equipment in your home, whether it be asking for an address or a phone number, and that's very much played a pivotal role for me in the last sort of couple of years as well. But when we look at things like smartphones and smart speakers and all those sorts of things, Kim, can I get you to take us through, I guess, some of the current scope of technologies that's out there?
Yeah. The focus of assistive technologies has tended to be fairly functional. It's sort of supporting education and for people who are blind and have low vision, orientation and mobility. And I think that's great, but I think it'd be good if the scope of technology is actually broadened to support work, accessible spreadsheets, Google Docs, access to office plans during the refurbishment of an office, perhaps, PowerPoint presentations. And then, of course, there's life outside work and education, So currently assistive technologies don't really focus a lot on sports, cultural activities like visiting the theatre or going to the movies. And I think they should broaden their scope to deal with these things.
What are we talking about there? Because particularly with things like the theatre, I know that there is audio description, but it might be one session, a matinee, and it might be, once within the 3 weeks of a show. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about that we need more of, or is it even things outside that?
It's certainly audio description is important. And as we've been talking about, it has to be so that people with disabilities have independence so that they can go and visit when they want to, feel empowered and, feel like the venue's accessible to them and, in fact, encouraging them to come along to them. And I think there's a long way to go. Particularly smaller events, but, art galleries, zoos, for example.
And Leonie, can you talk us through some of the innovative project examples that you've been working on? Particularly, I'm quite interested in the 3D printed models and how that all sort of works.
So my project specifically is looking at 3D printing for access to graphics for people who are blind or low vision. So you can see and we've started out looking at it basically as a new format for accessible graphics. So prior to this, we were relying mainly on tactile graphics, which are raised line drawings, and actually moving to a more technological world did influence even tactile graphics. So they started out being, there was a lot of handmade, handcrafted tactile graphics. And then we wanted to start producing them electronically and storing them electronically. That was the important thing. But it then meant we were using techniques that really just gave a one-dimensional raised tactile graphic. Sorry, I've digressed. So what we're using 3D printing for, mainly we've been looking at education and mapping. So mapping and also for artworks to convey tactually. And we're looking at guidelines similar to what we have for tactile graphics. So how can you optimize those 3D models so that they can be read most effectively? And what we have been finding is that it is a lot easier to interpret something in 3D if it is natively 3D. So things like stairs, for example, on a raised line drawing, you could use parallel lines or maybe a zigzag line or maybe an arrow, but you'd need to check the key to see what it means. Whereas if you have actual stairs going up on a little 3D map, then you can straight away tell what it is and which direction the stairs are going as well. So lots of advantages for it. And also just because it's a mainstream, well, not a mainstream technology, but a very common technology, it's available in schools. There's a lot of free software. Everyone's sharing their designs. So it's now becoming adopted within accessible production as a new format that's easier and more inclusive to read. So I think 3D printing is kind of one element, but it's also as a maker technology alongside things like laser cutting and CNC milling and low-cost electronics, e-textiles. All of those things are really helpful in terms of prototyping or creating one-off solutions for people. So we have other people in our group. So Kirsten Ellis was working with Ross Devet, who's a blind musician and has use of only one hand, and he wanted to be able to braille music using just one hand, and they worked together using all of this maker technology to produce a customized one-off solution for him that we've now discovered there are a few other people around the world can use as well, and we can send them the plans and they can make their own technology. So that's probably a lot and there's a lot more.
And what else could those sort of graphics be used for? I mean, I definitely know that back in, when I was initially at school, the teachers would use, for example, puff paint to make, sort of things look raised. So I would know, for example, the layout of the school and how to get around and navigate, sort of visualize the layout in my mind. Is it useful for those sorts of things as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I've been doing a lot of work in terms of mapping for 3D printing, because as I said, not just having things that are three-dimensional like stairs, but also symbols are a lot easier to interpret in 3 dimensions. And the most recent project that I've been working on has been with orientation and mobility trainers. So looking at what materials they use to create maps to work with their clients. And what we found was that they were using a huge variety of things, because basically there wasn't one solution that was working for everybody. It needed to be something that was cheap and portable, durable, and easy to read. So we've created some customized pieces for them to be able to create the maps that they want, but also that their clients can put pieces together. And they've got lots of fun little accessories with them that kids love playing with too. So they get really involved with it.
Kim, given you and Leona work very closely, is there anything else you'd like to add in on some of the sort of interesting projects that your team has been working on? It sounds like there's been a lot.
There has, and look, we'll talk just about another 2 of those. So Chatai Gonku, who's part of our team, recently worked with Tennis Australia and Aqua, and he developed a 3D audio streaming technology that was used with the Australian Open this year to allow blind listeners to, for the first time, hear where the ball is on the court in real time. And another PhD student, Sam Reinders, is looking at how you can combine 3D printed models with a conversational agent like Siri, and as an example, he's built a model of the solar system, which you can pick up a planet and then ask the planet questions. The model knows which planet you've picked up, and it can guide you when you want to place the planet back in its stand. And outside our group, Microsoft's Seeing Eye app, I think, is quite amazing. It uses computer vision to describe what is in front of the camera of your smartphone. So there's a whole lot of work that's happening all around the world and a lot of really exciting projects.
It sort of sounds very similar to that technology that I use to look at a menu at a cafe. Is it a bit similar to that? Sort of takes a photo and okay. That's really interesting. Maryanne, do you use that technology when you go out to sort of scan the menu on your own, or how do you sort of navigate that?
I do kind of combinations of things, I guess, like everybody. I do use that kind of technology to independently read a menu. When I first could do that, it was like revolutionary. So, of course, I wanted to try it. But yeah, and also GPS to navigate the environment is another one that is really useful. And, you know, I used to dream of the day that I could have one device that had my books I wanted to read, a GPS to navigate, you know, something to read things like menus, and, you know, my phone calls and internet and everything all in one device. And I have got that now in an iPhone. And, you know, at the time I would never have thought it would happen in my lifetime. But I love technology, and I love the options it gives us, you know, so we all get excited about new initiatives. And I was a maths student, as you know, throughout school, throughout university, and 3D technology would have been wonderful for all the graphs and stuff that I tried to navigate.
Yeah, and we do have a question from the audience, and I might throw this one at you, Maryanne. How do you deal with scanning QR codes for contact tracing purposes?
Interesting question. You've got to find where the QR code is in the first instance, you know, where on the wall, on the table, on the wherever. So that's one thing. I find, you know, if I usually am a bit reliant on someone to point me in the right direction, on the services Victoria, I'm in Melbourne, if it's one of them, that's quite simple. So long as I point my phone at the right place, it takes a photo and then it can confirm on my phone by speech that I've checked in because my details are stored. But many places use different ones, and then I struggle. I then find I am pretty dependent on people. I'm not sure, Naz, if that's your experience too.
It certainly is. Yeah, it's very much aligned with what you're experiencing. And I guess that leads me to our next question, which is, and anyone can jump in on this one, is what impacts has COVID had really on the lives of people with disability? I know for me particularly, it's really reduced my independence. I mean, you know, I need to, being blind and I'm a cane user, I very much rely on tactile sort of contact with, you know, bars on the buses or holding on to things or trailing along a railing or a wall to find a door or whatever it might be. And I think for me, I've been really nervous to get around the way I did before the pandemic, because I am a bit scared about, you know, making contact with things that other people have and carrying sanitizer around. And particularly, I just find that I'm going out on my own much less. And I was actually quite worried that I'd sort of start to lose my cane skills. And the other day, my husband and I were walking home with the groceries, and I actually said to him, can you just walk up ahead and go run home? And I just want to walk and make sure I can still identify our driveway independently. And it sounds really silly to say that, but it really means a lot to me that I'm still able to do that independently. So I think that's the biggest impact on me. Maryanne, is there anything that you in particular have experienced during the pandemic that you think would be good to share from your perspective?
Yeah, I have had similar experience to you. I don't go out as much now, so therefore you do worry about losing independence, because you know your ability and mobility is really based on continual experiences. So, and I'm paranoid about COVID, so I go out as little as possible, which doesn't help that situation. But for lots of people with disabilities, they've become more and more housebound. And I think that is a problem. And for, you know, very severe disabled people who have workers who come into their home to provide support to them, you know, they're nervous. If people who come into their home develop COVID, then they are at huge risk. So I think for many people, for many people with disabilities, COVID's brought isolation. That I think is a problem. But yeah, my experience is similar to yours. I go out less. I do sometimes worry about how mobile I'll be when I can get out again. But as I said earlier, you know, if my computer doesn't work, if JAWS doesn't work, I'm just stranded here, you know, unless my husband comes home and can fix it. But yeah, similar to you.
And also with that isolation comes a more heavy reliance on technology. And as you say, if no one's there and something, goes awry, how do you fix that? How do you navigate that? And it also brings back the issue of the haves and have-nots. If you don't have access to all the technology and you are increasingly isolated because of the pandemic, how do you navigate that? Kim, Leona, have you got anything else to add about the experiences of COVID and how that might be impacted by or because of technology, or how it could help or hinder?
We're both looking at each other.
Throwing you a curveball, sorry.
No.
I agree that it has made people rely a lot more on electronic and remote help rather than face-to-face help, and often it is just physical assistance that you need. So that's a big problem. And I think Kim would probably talk about the access to information about COVID as well has been.
I was going to say that, but I was going to say actually something that's been positive, I think, about COVID is being able to remotely access conferences and meetings and things like that, which makes it much easier for people with disabilities to be part of many sorts of events.
That's once we learned how to use Zoom and Teams.
Yeah,
there was a very fast introduction of the technology. But I agree, and things like real-time captioning, making such conferences and that more of accessible to people with different disabilities is terrific. And the sign interpreting, Auslan interpreting, that is on everything at every event now is a real big positive as well.
Definitely. I don't think we've seen it any more than we have in recent time, particularly at the ABC, we have bulletins specifically that are all Auslan interpreted, and we've really made an extra effort with that, and it's stuck around, which is what we always should have done. And it's so we've in some ways the pandemic's sort of accelerated that education and all that kind of thing, which is really positive. We have another question from an audience member. As tertiary educators, what are some of the things that we can do straight away within the existing system to make things fairer? Kim or Leonie, maybe Kim, we'll go to you first on this.
Yeah, sure. Look, information access is so important. So I think a few years ago, Leona and I and Matt Butler worked on a project looking at access to graphical materials by people who are studying at university who are blind and have low vision. And we conducted a survey across Australia, and there were significant problems with access. Really strange things like blind students were being told they had to identify which materials they needed to access when they couldn't actually see the materials in the first place to know whether diagrams were relevant or not. I think we've got the technology, we can really improve that, and that's something that we really need to do fairly quickly.
Leona, have you got anything to add on that as being part of the university, a big part of the university?
Really, I think there's a lot that we can be doing in terms of awareness. So everyone wants to be fair, but you need to know what it is that people are facing in order to be able to provide the services for them. Yes, I think we do have a lot more awareness that is needed for people with disabilities that people are not don't understand well enough.
And neither of us have been critical of the sort of support that the universities provide, the disability liaison unit and officers. I mean, across the board, try to support the students and generally do a good job of supporting students, but they're often overwhelmed. And it can be very difficult also because you've got academics, tutors, a large number of people who are not well trained and don't have an understanding of the particular needs of people with disability. And so, as Leona said, I think more training is required as well.
Maryanne here, I think another useful thing to think about might be promoting that to staff and tutors, that when you're recommending reading or texts for courses, that you consider what are already accessible texts and resources, so that you push that we are, they're available in an accessible format for everybody from the beginning. I mean, that would be something that would be really useful and would help promote that, changing people's views.
Maryanne, I think they're doing that in New South Wales right now. So they're only allowing textbooks that are actually accessible.
Good.
Used in schools. Yes, it's fantastic.
It's really good to see that progress. I mean, I remember when I was at university, 10, 12 plus years ago now, one of the books that I had to use wasn't available in accessible format, and the option was to basically provide me, with extra tuition, one-on-one tuition from a lecturer or an academic in that field 2 days a week instead of providing the textbook. Now, I actually thought I got the better end of the stick because I got one-on-one tuition, but that still doesn't break down that barrier of where's the book. It should be available because you've prescribed the text. It's what is compulsory and it's part of the curriculum, and it should just be made available. So it's really good to hear that there is some progress in that area. Leona, there's a question for you from Erin. She's interested in the mapping project. The organisation provides online maps, and they struggle to provide an equitable alternative that's accessible to everyone. And she says 3D printing is great. But are there any tactile solutions that are interactive and can be served online?
That is a very good question. There is actually a lot of research work being done in this area, and I think it comes down to having refreshable graphics displays, which are actually coming onto the market right now. I think that's a result of probably of the forgotten the name of the project. It was a project for refreshable Braille, transforming Braille project, that was it. So basically a lot of organisations throughout the world got together to work on this problem of refreshable Braille together to bring down the cost of it. And so that was for Braille, but then for graphics displays, you obviously need a lot more cells or a lot more space to be covered. And there are now some displays that are being produced and that will be produced soon. So I think that probably pairing things like online maps with refreshable displays is a really good step forward for mapping. The other one I was thinking of was mid-air haptics as well, is being worked on for like driverless cars, or for people who are driving to be able to feel a map as well. So yeah, there's a few technologies that are probably not affordable and here now, but in 5 to 10 years, definitely they will be.
Maryanne, if I can go to you now, in terms of Braille, is it used in some parts of the world more than others these days? And can you kind of go through some of the reasons why that might be?
Yeah, I think I'd just start by saying, in general, blindness is an ageing disability. You and I are unusual, I think, Naz, having been blind all of our lives. So the users of Braille are small numbers of blind people, really, and people use it for different purposes. In my case, I feel myself very fortunate that I learned to be literate. My grammar, my spelling, I can, read fluently Braille, so I consider myself lucky. I think in many parts of the world, it's a bit of a different picture. The great technology that has made production of Braille more streamlined, like Leona described earlier, refreshable Braille devices, which are expensive, and even the one that she mentioned just recently that was globally developed is still quite a lot of money for people who live in developing countries. And people who live in developing countries tend to use, the old-fashioned Braille, piece of paper, lock it into a frame with 6 little indents for the Braille, 6 Braille cells and a stylus to punch holes. Very slow, very tedious, but it is effective and it is very inexpensive. And in lots of parts of the world, especially in Africa, power isn't always reliable. So, all these modern devices can also fail because of just access to power. And then, we all need, with our devices, maintenance and replacement, etc. So I think it'd be fair to say In the poorer parts of the world, Braille is still used more. People have been telling me for 20 years that Braille will no longer be required, but yet it's still here, a bit like the paperless world that never has happened. So I'm a great advocate of Braille, but I think it's a combination of Braille and other things. And if I think back to my university days, and not one textbook was available for me in a format I could read, and I would be lucky if I got an audio version of the book the week before or the week after the end of the year exam. So, like life has changed. So I kind of want to really talk about and keep in mind it's the combination of things that we all use, different technologies, depending on what aspects of life we're trying to live, and where we live is important. So, a big point for me, I keep hammering in universal design, design accessible, and design accessible so that we don't have to spend extra money to buy different devices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think interesting point that you said there, that you're being told that, Braille won't be required in years to come. Does that worry you?
No, because they've been saying it for 20 years and it's still here.
So you don't think it's ever going to happen?
I don't think so. I think it'll be one of a collection of things that we as blind people with disabilities will choose to use depending on the needs.
Can I jump in, because I hear that all the time as well, and it drives me crazy because it's so easy to argue against, because Braille is the equivalent of print. So when print goes out of date, then Braille will go out of date, but not before.
Yeah, that's a really good a really good point. Some more questions coming in from the audience. Has the increase on our reliance on online interfaces rather than phoning up a hotel or restaurant made things easier and faster or harder? Maybe if I can go to you first, Maryanne.
I think it would be a mixture. I think, it can be easier and it can be quite good if the interface or the site we're dealing with is accessible. But we know, although we have guidelines for, was it WCAG 2.0, we had 2.0 for developing on accessible websites. Australia, lots of government departments have signed up to it, but most of them don't meet these standards. So I'd say it's easy if the site is accessible, or can be, but it's extremely difficult when they are not.
Yeah, I think it depends definitely on the device and the interface. I mean, if I look up something on my smartphone, look up a phone number, the name of a restaurant, all that sort of thing, there's an actual button that says call, and you can hit it and that's it, you're ringing them. Whereas I find online, if I'm actually sitting in front of my laptop, it's a little more difficult. So it just depends. But then I've also got the smart speaker at home that often can just provide you with that information as well. So yeah, it really does depend. Another question: if I want to develop products to serve the disability community to make a food rice paper roll. Sorry, as I'm reading, other comments are coming in, and my JAWS screen reader is reading over the question. So I'm hearing multiple things at once. So if I want to develop products to serve the disability community to make a food rice paper roll, which doesn't need to be cooked, or just use normal water to make it, who should I contact and work with to develop that kind of product? Kim, maybe you're the person to go to for that sort of thing.
Possibly. Come and talk to us. Vision Australia might be another organisation to talk to. Leona, I'm going to handball to you at the moment. Do you have any thoughts about who would be the right people to talk to?
I have not got a good sense of what the product is, but I'm happy if anyone wants to contact me after this question, then I can forward them on.
Yeah, I mean, let's say it's any product. I mean, the two of you would be very good contacts
absolutely.
to go to. I'd say whatever ideas you have, throw them at Kim and Leona and let's see what they can come up with. And fingers crossed. What are some ways that inclusive technology is lagging behind? Kim or Leona, do either of you want to take this one first?
Sure. So I think, well, firstly, there's some inertia in taking advantage of new technologies. But I think one of the problems is currently inclusive design is still, or inclusive technologies is still seen as niche. There are some notable exceptions. Microsoft and Apple, I think, are really trying to include inclusive features throughout the design of their technologies. But it's really important that inclusive technology isn't seen as something that's separate, but really it needs to be integrated into the design from the very beginning. And that's, so many different reasons for that, but it's also because accessibility features are also useful for the whole population. They just make products more accessible in a variety of different contexts. The other thing is, I think inclusive technologies tend to be fairly, shall I say, functional and boring, not necessarily very engaging or attractive, and I think that's a real pity. Mainstream products, that's an important part of the design process, is to create something that's engaging and attractive. And that has impact on how these technologies are used. So if you're collaborating with sighted people in a school, if you're a blind student, then it can be embarrassing perhaps to be using things that look clunky or really differentiate you and are not cool. So that's one advantage that we've seen with the 3D printed objects rather than using tactile graphics. The 3D printed models are seen as really attractive and fun. And so everybody wants to collaborate with them. So there's no sort of stigma associated with being blind.
Leona, is another problem that for too long people with disability haven't been included in neither design of these inclusive technologies and involved in the testing and provided the jobs to make this stuff happen?
Absolutely. I was going to say that. And I think there are a lot of examples of research that has just been, the efforts have been put into the wrong place because no one's been consulted properly in the first place. So every year there's a new smart cane and a new sign language interpreter that is not needed. So I definitely, in terms of, we do need to have people not just consulted, but being the designers and the originators of these new technologies. But in order for that to happen, they do need to have the opportunity. So in school, they need to be able to access every aspect of school. We did, I think Kim mentioned the study we did on accessible graphics, and as part of that, we found that STEM representation for people who are blind and low vision is much lower than the general population because they've not had access to that sort of content. It's been more difficult. And employment as well, obviously, is a problem for people, not because of their abilities, but because of low expectations of others. So people need to be supported in order to reach those tech roles and be invited into those tech roles so that we can design things from the outset from a much broader perspective than your white males, young white males. Yeah.
That's so important.
Yeah. And Maryanne, is there anything you would like to say on that question of, what could be improved in terms of going forward?
I think I totally agree with what Leona and Kim just said, but in addition, I think we need to have people with disabilities as user testers of products, because sometimes they might meet the minimum accessibility standards, but when you as a person with disability go to use a product, they're not as accessible as people thought it was. So I think that's another one. But I would still like to see us do not us meaning us personally, but work to be done on a lot of household appliances and accessible communities, so that if we're in Melbourne or Sydney and we want to get a train or we want to enter a building, we get the same information on our GPS or whatever devices or whatever information is provided, so that we can independently and confidently move around the community. So I think access to the community, access to appliances in the home, and another big one is independent accessible voting. We still do not have that universally across the country. We still, as people with disabilities, often rely on others to get into the building, to vote, to actually register our vote as blind people, and so on. So there are just a few areas I think would be good if we made some advances in.
And where do you think technology is expected to head in the future? Kim, can I throw to you on this?
Yeah. So as we've talked about with some of the examples, I think AI has tremendous potential. Conversational agents, computer vision, I think are going to make quite a big difference. Also augmented reality. So for people with low vision, digitally enhancing what they can see, perhaps making text larger or simply reading it aloud, I think will make a big difference. And as Leona talked about earlier, technologies like 3D printing, low-cost electronics and everything allow bespoke solutions. So solutions that are suitable for, maybe only a handful of people worldwide, but now, we can afford to create these sorts of things.
And Leona?
Have anything extra to add? I think it's covered. Yep.
We do have another question from the audience. How about using a smartphone application for Braille or robotic sensors to find out, I think it's supposed to mean the objects around us?
I think definitely, using computer vision. And one of the things I was thinking about was like with driverless cars using computer vision to predict the traffic, then that's another thing that you could apply to pedestrians who are blind or have low vision. So, Kim?
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's right. Microsoft, a lot of different organisations, we are looking at how you can use computer vision to help describe the world around somebody who's blind.
How might that work in the work that you've done so far on that, Kim? Just to explain it for the uninitiated.
So, look, very early, very, very early days for us at this stage. But for example, with somebody who's got low vision, you can imagine having augmented reality glasses, so digitally enhancing the scene as much as possible, but they look at a particular object, can't quite make it out, or some text, and then computer vision will describe what that object is or will read the text aloud, so that you have this sort of interaction between the person looking at their environment, or indicating the sorts of things that they're interested in, and then having the computer vision or the AI providing the sort of assistance that you might have had from a sighted companion.
We've got a couple more questions before we do need to wrap up. Maryanne, maybe this question is best for you. Do you have any ideas on how we can make it more accessible to poorer countries? I think it being, the technology here. Do you have any thoughts on that? Kim and Leona, jump in at any point on that as well.
I think Kim identified earlier that the take-up of cell phones or smartphones in developing countries has been huge. It's almost like they missed the generation of landlines, which is probably a good thing. So I think that technology is good. There is also some work happening across the world in open source being a great way to make things available to people who can't afford to buy them. For example, to buy JAWS in this country would probably cost you over $2,000. If you use NDVA, I think it's called non-visual desktop access, that is open source, that is free. So every time I meet people from developing countries or visit developing countries, I take memory sticks or USB with that on it, so they can download onto their computers. That's those who have got computers. So open source, I think, is the way to go, because even a cheap Braille display is still a lot of money for many people in the world. Remembering people with disabilities everywhere in the world are far more likely to be unemployed than those without disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
Okay. And look, just in wrapping up, I think as final comments, I mean, from each of you, if I could really hear the perspective from what you feel about Australia's progress on this, as Australian industries really tried to take measures to kind of help the emergence of technology and to make sure that everyone at least here can have access to that. Leona, we'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that NVDA is Australian also, so definitely we're doing the best that we can, I think. Yeah.
And Kim?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, I think in the last couple of years, there's been a sort of a change. People are now starting to really seriously think about supporting people with disabilities. And there is a lot of different companies that I've been talking to, so Australian, but internationally, I think for whatever reason, people are now going, yeah, actually it is time to make things more inclusive. So I think it's a very, very exciting time.
And Maryanne, I'd love to give you the final word.
Yeah,
What's your take?
I think, with the introduction and adoption of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has been a really paramount thing that's happened. Human rights is a big issue nowadays. So we as people with disabilities have the rights to access, whether it be information technology and a whole range of things. And I think also with the introduction of the NDIS, people now who have disabilities, who are participants, are often able to get a lot of the technology funded through that scheme that we once were not able. So I think, as Kim and Leona said, lots of things happening from the perspective of developers, but also from the perspective of people with disabilities being able to get access to things they previously were not.
Thank you so much to everyone for their questions, their comments, all your thoughts. I'm apologies if there was someone that we wasn't able to get to your question. Thank you so much for participating, and thank you to our panelists, Maryanne Diamond, Kim Marriott, and Leona Holloway. Really appreciate your insights, your perspective, and your time this afternoon. Thank you very much, and I look forward to really finding out what great new technologies can emerge from particularly Kim and Leona's work going forward, and for everything that Maryanne has done for the community and more broadly to raise the profile of technologies, including Braille. I really, for one, I'm very excited and personally very much looking forward to where we can go in the future with this. I think the only way is up, really. So thank you to everyone who helped organise this session today. It's particularly been a little tricky getting us all together virtually and going through everything. So thank you for that. I'm Naz Campanella. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your day.